Hello, everyone. I hope you're all having a great conference. My name is Giel Tettelaar. I'm the chairman of the IFCI Register. We are one of the appointed notified bodies for the EU Fertilizing Products Regulation. And in today's presentation, I want to give you a short overview of what the new Fertilizing Products Regulation is and what it could potentially mean for companies that want to export their product to the European Union and want to use the FPR as a way of doing so. Just to start with a short introduction, the Fertilizing Products Regulation, or FPR 2019-1009, as it's sometimes called, creates a single harmonized market for EU fertilizing products. It's important to note that it is optional. It does not replace national rules. It instead creates a different pathway of marketing your products. And so if you already sell, for example, fertilizers or biostimulants to the European Union, you can continue to do so. However, with this new pathway, the FPR creates a way of legally selling a large range of new types of fertilizing products. These include fertilizers, organic fertilizers, inorganic fertilizers, and organo-mineral fertilizers, but also more novel products like biostimulants. It does that by creating a few different ways of doing what's called conformity assessment. These are divided up into modules. A lot of products can be self-certified, which means you can assess them yourself. You do not need to involve a regulatory authority or a notified body, and simply by performing an internal assessment, you can market the product in the EU. Some products, like for example biostimulants, require the involvement of what's called a notified body. This is a private conformity assessment body that can issue you a certificate and indicate to regulatory authorities, to customers, as well as internally that you do indeed comply. There are two procedures for bringing biostimulants onto the market. This is the module B+C and the module D1. Under module B+C, you perform a design assessment of a specific product. We would assess that the product itself complies. This would all happen remotely. We would assess that the product is effective. And once the product complies, we would issue the certificate. There's also the option to do module D1 assessment. That involves physical inspection and an assessment of the company's management system. Now, the way the FPR works is it creates categories for different types of components that are used to make fertilizing products. And depending on the components that specific products fall under, they have to comply with specific requirements. Some materials, for example, those where composting is used as a processing method, require the management system assessment. Others don't. The FPR is the first time at a European level that there is a single framework for biostimulants. There is a method for selling them, and there is a method to prove their efficacy. And indeed, notified bodies are required for biostimulants. And what the FPR also introduces is the principle of CE marking, which is a guarantee that when your product complies, you can sell the product in every single EU country without additional national rules. And to follow up on those national rules, what's important is that there are stark differences between the new EU regulation that went into effect 2 years ago and the national rules that are very common in today's biostimulant market. Firstly, there is a single registration. You do one assessment procedure with a single body, notified body, and instead of having to go through 27 different countries or doing mutual recognition, you have a single certificate that shows that you comply for every single country. That also means that there are significantly lower administrative burdens if you can indeed fall under the FPR, but it also means that there are clear rules for selling throughout the European Union. There are strict requirements surrounding efficacy, and trials do have to be performed. Having said that, especially when managing different registrations, in the long term, the FPR potentially is cheaper. But it is also a lot faster to get to market because the assessment timelines with notified bodies are relatively short. Assessments are usually done within a matter of a few weeks instead of months or years, as used in other regulatory schemes within the European Union. And what is important to note, that even though you can continue to sell a product under national rules, some national authorities are implementing the FPR as a requirement and potentially even a replacement for their national rules. So when we speak of getting to market in the FPR, we will talk of conformity assessment and certification. And in that regard, these notified bodies are very important because they essentially replace registration authorities. You do not need to deal with national public authorities because you have to deal with private certification bodies. That also means you choose your notified body. It does not matter which one you choose. You just have to choose one. And the one that you work with, once you have a certificate from them, you can get to market. That also means notified bodies are pragmatic. You can approach them, they will answer your questions, and they will support. Once you submit a dossier to a notified body and you get approved, you get a certificate with a certificate number, and that allows you to get to market. It is as simple as that. And certification is valid for a period of 3 to 5 years, which also means you have some predictability in how you can continue to sell the product in future. Because changes must also be reported by the manufacturer, there is a lot of responsibility on the manufacturer, not just to report changes, but also to make sure that they continue to sell a compliant product. So you have to take this obligation seriously. Of course, when someone speaks of a regulatory regime within the European Union becoming more efficient and potentially even easier or more straightforward to comply with, the question is always, what is the catch? And in truth, there is not really one. Certification is in principle straight to the point. There are a few documents that you need. These are things like your analysis of nutrients and contaminants and pathogens in the product. You need to understand what are the ingredients in your product and how do they comply. You provide an explanation of the claims of your product. What does the product do? And that you have to prove. And of course, you have to prepare a label. In principle, the timeline is a matter of a few weeks. Then you get an assessment report. If the product complies, it can also be sent to, it can also be certified. That also means your lead time is relatively short, and it also keeps the cost low. In principle, the range for certification is between the 2,500 euros and 4,000 euros, depending on the complexity of your claims. Under Module B, usually there is a 5-year expiry date. And if after 5 years, your product does not change, and it still complies because the regulation itself hasn't changed, then there's also no recertification fee. So as a short overview, how does this process work? Firstly, and this is an example of one notified body, specifically the FCI Register, how we would approach it. And we would always start by trying to understand what is your product. And so we would set up an initial Teams call to understand what is your situation, what are you making, and what is the best plan of action. We would also make an offer for a fixed price, so you know upfront what you have to expect. You would sign a contract with a notified body after filling in an application form, and after that, that's the first step to be completed. And now there are only 2 more steps to go. In step 2, you would send in information, documents, other information on your product, files, and we would assess it. Any non-conformities that are raised, you could resolve, and you would resolve them by sending in more information. Once everything is compliant, you would complete step 2. Within step 3, we would review the information, we would perform a few administrative actions, and if everything complies, we would issue the certificate. In principle, you can decide the timeline. If you send in everything quickly and everything is prepared, it is really a matter of a few weeks. If these things take more time, then potentially you have to wait a few more weeks than the regular timeline, because of course you also potentially need more information from, for example, suppliers, which might take time to gather. It's important to note that non-conformities are not a problem. They're both an opportunity to improve the product or the technical documentation, but more importantly than that, they also do not lead to a denial of certification. The process will simply be stopped until the non-conformities are removed. And so it is something you can correct, you can implement fixes for, and you can proceed towards getting your certificate and getting the product to market. And so what does it actually look like when we're looking at a certificate? Well, it looks very much like this. It's always a specifically defined format for your specific product. It identifies you, it identifies the product. It has claims on the label relating to the specific biostimulant claims that are proven, and it can be verified. It comes with a certificate number that you can use, and then you can sell the product throughout the EU. That's it. This is all that you need. If you have this, a biostimulant can be sold in the EU in every single country. And then some frequently asked questions, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. So if there are any questions that have arisen, either during this talk or just in general that you might have from selling to the EU, do please feel free to always reach out. But as a starting point, it is important to note that you do not always need trials, but you do always need evidence. And if you do not have specific field trials on your product, then potentially literature studies are an option. Either way, the field trials have to comply with a specific European technical specification. You can search for this online and you can download a copy, but there are specific requirements on things like how many replicates and what the plot size is for the trials that you perform. A notified body or an EU consultant can review your field trial designs, and indeed we would recommend this to make sure that you comply with the standard and make sure that there are no design issues in trials that you do perform. Indeed, the EU regulation also speaks of having to do a risk assessment. And what is key here is that you have an understanding of what your product is and what the risks are that are associated with this. If you have a safety data sheet, you understand that the type of product that you're selling or that you're applying for certification has been used before. In practice, you don't really need to do a risk assessment. But if it's very novel, potentially it's something that's worth considering. The FPR, when you dive into it, also contains a list of microorganisms. Specifically, it contains 4 strains. Any microorganisms which are not included in that list or in that those 4 families cannot be sold yet. These are Azospirillum, Mycorrhiza, Rhizobium, and Azotobacter. Any other strains, any other species cannot yet be sold under the FPR regulation. Animal byproducts, anything relating to that can only be sold when the delegated act, so when the regulation is amended. At the moment, it is not yet possible. When we look at technical documentation, it is also important to note that there are quite a few requirements surrounding analysis and testing. And it is important that the testing is performed in an EU laboratory that works under accreditation, which means if you are preparing for assessing a file or submitting a file under the FPR, make sure you have, at least for the notified body, EU accredited analysis. Of course, the methods for analysis are really up to you. The manufacturer can choose which methods are most suitable for their product, where the EU methods are preferred. But if you can prove equivalence to national methods, that is fine. And the choice is with the manufacturer. It is also important to note when it comes to the efficacy trials themselves that you have to define claims and you have to prove them, but you don't necessarily have to start with all of your claims that you want for the product and prove them. If you want to start with a smaller set of claims and then expand that list of claims later on for your label, you can do this by simply submitting in new field trial reports. And as said earlier, you don't need to work with a specific national authority. You work with a notified body, they can explain to you what the specific requirements are, and then from there on, you can submit your file and get a certificate. Once you have a certificate, you can get to market. That's the big new change in approach that the FPR introduces. And as a summary, I would say it's impossible to make a complete overview of this regulation and the full impact that it has on you as an individual manufacturer. This is a brief overview of the most important points, namely that trials are required, that this is a new route to market, and that does create a pathway for biostimulants. But if you want specific input on your situation, always feel free to reach out. There are no obligations in that regard. If you just have some questions, feel free to send us an email, and we will be more than happy to help and provide input on how the EU regulation could potentially work for you, or perhaps not. With that, I want to thank you all for the time for listening. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there, but I hope next year that can be different, and I wish you all a very successful conference. Thank you.